So I'm Andy. I'm here as a member of the Authenticate Program Committee. Some of you will recognize me from things like Identiverse and the work that I've done with Kantara and Curity and various other places. Couple of quick kind of housekeeping things. Please take a look in the app. If you haven't added this session to your schedule, please do that. That will give you access to the session survey, which I'd be very grateful, and I know the presenters would, and the program committee would, if you would fill that survey in for each of the sessions that you go to, including this one. Please be constructive and helpful, but that feedback is very useful both for us and obviously for the presenter. We may have some time for questions at the end. If we do, you are welcome, if you're in the room, to come and use the mic up the front, or you can put questions in the app, and we will try and filter those if we can. For those of you online, hi, everyone online. Thank you for joining us. Same thing there. Obviously, you can't use the mic in the room, but you're very welcome to put questions in the app, and we will try and pick those up. I think that's everything. Now, I'm tempted to carry on rambling for a little while, partly because I know that our next speaker has timed his talk precisely, and I'm very tempted to see if I can just throw him off completely, but I probably shouldn't. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Ian Glazer.
Thank you, sir. Buckle up. I am well rested, I am well caffeinated, and that is going to be a thing. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back at Authenticate, the opportunity to talk to you about something that has required a little bit of vulnerability on my part. It is also an honor to follow Andrew, so I appreciate the opportunity. So the last 12 months, I thought I understood our identity market and the boundaries, what features were in what markets, what capabilities I could get from what sort of products. Turns out that map is a little fuzzy. Let me give you an example. So access management, big markety type thing. So access management could mean single sign-on. But when we talk about single sign-on, really what we're talking about is probably federation, or if you were alive when Snuffleupagus was imaginary, we're talking about web access management, but really at the end of the day what we're talking about is single sign-on. But no, we can't have nice things, so we call this access management. But wait, it gets worse. So then we also have things like fine-grained access control. That's seemingly incorporated into the access management market, which is also known as externalized authorization management, which is kind of sort of related to policy-based access control, which really is at the end of the day now just called authorization. But no, we can't have nice things. That's access management too. But yet there is more. Access management also is related to strong authentication, which also sort of known as risk-based authentication. These two gave rise to a whole host of forms of authentication, and it continues to baffle me why this is all also access management. I was looking for some path through this chaos to figure out how to think about what is in identity architectures. So what I came up with is that there are 4 components in every identity architecture: policy, orchestration, execution, and data. So what I want to do is go through each of these, give you some examples, some definitions, and then teach you how to put that into practice in your own world. Let's start with policy. No matter what kind of system we are talking about, identity or not, frankly, you need rules of the road. It does not matter particularly whether the rules of the road were built by a human or a robot augmenting a human. We need these policies, and not just the creation of these policies, but ongoing maintenance, refinement. I need to know what the impact of an access management policy is if I was to turn it on. I also need to understand how to make that policy actionable. What will it affect in the enterprise? And in this bucket of policy, I include 2 more things. One is visualization, and the other is translation. So visualization, and I put this in quotes because when we often say, oh, we need to visualize something, it leaves out a portion of the practitioners who have vision impairment, right? There are other modalities in which I need to interact, or our constituents interact with policy. Furthermore, there are people, likely in this room, who are fairly text-based. One of them may be in that beanbag. And there are other people in this room that are more graphic visually oriented. There's multiple ways to express and interact with policy. So when we say visualization, it really needs to be much broader than what we typically talk about. And that doesn't even begin to cover the notion of conversational design, how I can interact with something in a more conversant way. And this really becomes translation. So imagine being able to say, what does a policy do, right? Here is a list of entitlements. If someone had these, what could they do? And imagine that the system then spits out actually a narrative, grounded in reality, it's key, as to what those entitlements would actually enable. And what if this wasn't just a one-way street? What if this was a two-way street, right? I could start with long-form policy and get out, okay, here's the policy that we're actually going to enact. We're going to drive this into the governance system, the access management system. So policy is those rules of the road, not just the construction, but the ongoing maintenance and the ways we can actually understand what they mean and what they do. Next up, orchestration. Talking about orchestration, actually we got to start somewhere else. We have to start in replacement cycles. So, not to contradict Andrew, but if we think about our major components inside of an identity architecture, the replacement cycle is roughly 10 years. Give or take, that's how frequently you can swap out a major component in your architecture. Which means that you're going to need to augment that capability if you have other business needs, right? If the business says, we need this other kind of capability, you're not going to rip and replace your IDP. You're going to have to lay beside some other technology to help boost that, if you will, give it the capabilities you need. And this is how we end up with identity fabrics. This is how we end up with, essentially, a confederacy of related fit-for-purpose services. And by the way, I actually argue that you still have this, even if you're doing sort of best of platforms, single vendor sourcing, you still often have these orchestration needs, despite what the vendor will tell you. And so in order to do a fabric, you actually have to orchestrate those components. That means coordination between them. Now, one of the other things that this requires isn't just coordination, but a sort of a unified sense of bookkeeping. So consider this. I have a scenario in which I'm not going to give someone production access unless there's a ServiceNow ticket for them. That's going to trigger some evaluation to determine what the right access rights are. That's going to kick off the provisioning system to go do something, and the user account gets updated. Now I log in, I go use that, great. The ticket gets closed because I've done my work. Now the provisioning system goes back in, takes away that access, closes out the whole thing. This involved multiple people, multiple components in my identity infrastructure. None of them had the full picture of what was going on, which means I need a form of sort of unified bookkeeping to understand, did the access get revoked at the end of the action? That's really important, especially if I'm trying to do things like zero standing privilege. And guess what? It's not just identity practitioners that need this bookkeeping. Security really wants to know about this stuff. Anytime we've got any form of legitimate or illegitimate privilege escalation, they want to know. So orchestration is not only the coordination of our components, but it's also this sort of unified bookkeeping. This brings us to the third component, execution. So execution is really where the rubber meets the road. This is where we actually broker SSO, or we provision a user account, we issue a token. And many of you in this room, well, a little bit of a nerd alert, this is where the standards come in. This is stack ranked in order of the things that I like. It's actually not true. Sorta. But this is where our standards are expressed. Now, this work, to be clear, is very difficult. And it's very nuanced. Interpreting all the shalls and the shoulds of a standard is not simple work. And the people that are in this room and in our industry who do this work have a hard job. But the interesting thing is this work is also commoditized. And that's an interesting tension. Now, to be fair, there are differentiated use cases, right? So for example, let's say you're interested in open banking. Most regions of the world, to do open banking, you need to support OpenID Connect FAPI profiles. That's non-trivial. That's some hard stuff. And you should expect to sort of pay for that specialized capability in a lot of cases. Maybe you have to augment what you have with a specialized service. But for use cases, the common ones, SSO into SaaS or social sign-on or provisioning to Workday, you absolutely should not be paying for those capabilities. Those are table stakes. So the execution layer is where, well, so to speak, the rubber meets the road, where we actually do the work. Now this leaves us with the last component, data. Data in identity management has been an afterthought. There's two reasons for this. One is due to the narrow focus of our products, I'll explain, and having to do with what we do with data exhaust. So identity components in your infrastructure, unless you built them yourselves, only operate on the information they can gather from their execution layer. Your provisioning system knows the things, user accounts, and entitlements that it can gather through its connector to that application. Access management system knows about what SSO sessions it created through the things that it is federated with. So it only has a certain slice of the known universe. The other thing is that we tended to, as identity practitioners, give away the value and the data of our data exhaust. Our identity systems were generating lots of interesting information about their actions and things that happened within them. And we kind of tossed that over the transom to CSIRT and went, hey, here's the logs you asked for. Cool. And that was we did ourselves a disservice. To be fair, there's good reason why this happened. Mostly it's because when we built a lot of these products, they were not designed for high volume or high velocity or multidiscipline data. That has got to change. And I'm seeing evidence that it actually is in the industry. And think about this. If I have this confederacy of orchestrated services in my identity fabric, I have to have a robust data layer. Think about it this way. 3 main pillars of an identity architecture. Each of them has their own 4 components. And I guarantee you, you know this, that any single data subject is probably in at least 2 of these data layers, maybe all 3. That's not great because each one has a slightly different view of the world. This gets really bad when you start augmenting your core identity capabilities with other things to get the job done. Now, data subject is in all of these different data layers and everyone's got a different view of the universe. How on earth are we going to orchestrate this? And it's not going to happen really cleanly. We've got to move to kind of a world like this where there's a shared data layer for my entire identity fabric. This is not simple, but this is actually beginning to happen. Consider, we're a little late to the game in this regard. Our security peers have had a concept of a security data lake. We don't necessarily, as identity practitioners, have that same notion yet. Now, there are organizations, there are those, they walk among us, who have built these things. That is a mountain of currency and broken bodies. This is not trivial to do. But I think the economics of this are about to change really radically. And when that happens, when we have a more democratized identity data layer, wow, all sorts of things can start to bloom from that. So I'm very, very excited about the data layer. So we have these 4 components. Okay, so what? What do we do with them? Like, great, you've now given me names for things. Let's go put it into practice. So what we can do is we can take the 4 components and we can pick one of our identity systems and say the SSO system, and we can walk through each of these components and say, what capabilities does this system provide me? So my SSO system has a series of policies ranging from the mundane configuration to maybe robust MFA orchestration with third-party risk signals. From an orchestration layer, because it's got to grab those third-party risk signals, it's got to orchestrate what that interaction looks like. From an execution layer, well, this is good old-fashioned doing the SSO work, brokering OAuth, protocol brokering. And from a data layer, you got to think about it in two ways. The data that SSO system would consume is the directory, what users, what groups, et cetera. And maybe user attributes, most likely, potentially risk signals. And what would it produce? Well, it's going to produce, every time I try to log in, we're going to log that, what MFA challenges, maybe risk evaluations. So you can actually do this analysis for each one of your identity components, right? So this becomes a lather, rinse, repeat exercise. I can say, layer on, what does provisioning look like? So now what I've got is a bit of a map that says, for each of my systems, here's the kind of capabilities they provide at each layer, at each component. But we can do more. So we can fold in a little bit of a sense of time of use. So the world traditionally in identity had been split into two pieces: admin time, essentially things we do before the user actually uses a resource. We'll go provision of some accounts. This is typically IGA. And then runtime. So essentially, as the user is logging in, this is access management. What do we need to do to set up that experience and create that session? But increasingly, and very crucially, there is a third: time of use. It's actually while the individual is using those resources. This event time gives us a near real-time signal channel to actually process what's happening inside the application and the entire business context. Device telemetry, transactional telemetry, all of these things can be folded in to make policy decisions. Something that Andrew talked about, and honestly, he's one of the leading thinkers in this space. So we can go back and fold in those times of use and say, all right, we have the 4 components. We have 3 times of use, and we can actually start to look at what systems live in each bucket. Using time of use, now we start to clump together the capabilities that we have in the enterprise, right? And it starts to allow us to make some decisions around what may have to change to meet a certain kind of requirement. But we can go further. We can also think about replacement cycles, because this is a reality, right? I have asked around, and average for an IGA system is an 8 to 10 year replacement cycle. No one is really aggressively ripping out SailPoint every year and replacing it with Savient and then again and again and again and again. You don't do that. Like, no one would survive that. IDP is about 7 to 9 years. Sorry, Mike, I should have done the other way around. That's my bad. So we have the times of use and the 4 components. But now let's fold in, how long is it going to take to replace these things? Like, when are things due to be replaced? In this scenario, we put in a new OAuth tier for a specialized purpose. Imagine we've deployed something just to do CAPI for us, for example. But the rest is sort of a, let's call it middle-aged identity architecture. And so again, I can look at the 4 components. I can now take into account time to replace and say, well, you know, the business has new requirements. Let's say they're regulatory, that we've got to take into consideration device posture and third-party risk signal before determining whether I should create a session for someone. So that's really focusing on need in terms of in the ability to describe a policy and to describe orchestration to make that happen. But that system, which doesn't have the capability the business needs, it's about 5 years old, right? So like 5 years to replacement. What are our choices? Well, we could wait until the vendor provides that capability, or if they don't, just wait to replace the whole darn thing in 5 years. Problem, there's a variety of constituents who will not wait for you to replace that. So you could make this choice, but it's not going to be super fun for the next 5 years. So the alternative is, let's augment this. Let's add a specialized capability. Let's add a specialized IDP and chain them together that gives me the ability to pull context from the device, that gives me these risk signal capabilities, and essentially just augment this piece of the puzzle with the capabilities that I need. And so using replacement cycle gives us at least a clear-eyed way of looking at, what am I going to replace? When am I going to replace it? What should I be thinking about augmenting and folding into my overall identity fabric? So I'm still trying to figure out how this whole darn market works. And before my current role, I was running identity at Salesforce. And One fun feature about Salesforce is we changed product names about 1 billion times before products were launched and about 4 more times afterwards, right? So if you're a Salesforce customer, you know this very, very well. So when you see some crazy thing like, hey, this week we're launching Taco Force, you're kind of like, well, really? And what you learned was, don't hold on too tightly to the name. Focus on what the outcome of the thing was going to be and the features that enabled it. Now, I did not think that that lesson was going to be applicable in the identity market, but it turns out it's super handy right now. I think all of us, to some degree, are suffering from a sort of a blurry map of what we believe identity management is, what the market boundaries look like, what goes where. It's a complicated market, and it's changing actually really rapidly. But if we think about and hold close to what are the outcomes that the business needs, our stakeholders need, what features will enable those things, that's a way better way of actually thinking about what kind of architecture you want to build, what kind of needs you actually have. Especially when you realize, for a variety of reasons, you're probably going to be in an augment type stance versus a wait and replace type stance. I just think it's harder and harder to stay there on the right. And so by thinking about things like the replacement cycle times, by thinking about what capabilities are actually used when, that sort of time of use analysis, and breaking it down by these 4 components, you actually start to get a little bit more clarity about what you have, what you might need, what you might likely replace. And so the 4 components of our identity architecture, policy, orchestration, execution, and data, give us this way of thinking about our modern architectures. Helps us build a stronger, better one sooner. And to me, that's super exciting. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is lunchtime.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. We are pretty much at time, so I'm not going to hold you back from lunch. I'm going to say thank you very, very much to those of you that joined us online. To those of you that joined us in the room.
Andy, thanks you greatly.
And we look forward to seeing you later. Have a great day. Thank you.